Welcome again. I'm Hotung. As most Hong Kongers know, Hotung is one of the founding families of Hong Kong, and certainly the primary founding Eurasian family in Hong Kong. As a Hong Konger, I'm disturbed to realize that most of us do not know the whole truth as to the how and whys that gave birth to Hong Kong. The challenge of this presentation is to expose the lies and the propaganda and the untrue history that my generation and everyone before me was taught with regard to the birth of Hong Kong. Even if you do a historical search today, you'll be correctly told that the British Empire acquired Hong Kong in the First Opium War, which was ignited.
On July 7th, sailors from the Jardine and Matheson ships, the Mangalore and Carnatic, took shore leave in the village of 𝑪𝘰𝘮𝘮𝘦 in Kowloon. After consuming too much alcohol, a drunken brawl ensued whereby a villager, 𝑳𝘪𝘬𝘦𝘯𝘵 was beaten to death. The top English officer, Charles Elliot, presented 𝑳𝘪𝘬𝘮𝑗's family with $1,500 and additional $100 to the villagers, in compensation. The Chinese Imperial Commissioner, Lin Zheqiu, demanded the English turned over the wrongdoers, which was denied by Elliot. Instead, 2 of the 5 sailors involved were found guilty of rioting and 3 were found guilty of rioting and assault. They were all fined a sum of money. The first 2 sailors were sentenced to 3 months of hard labor and the latter 3 were sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. These sentences were to be served in England. However, after arriving in England, all 5 were set free, on the grounds that Elliot's trial that was held in Hong Kong harbour on board the English ship, Fort William, held no jurisdiction. Elliot was the presiding judge, and English merchants had made up the jury. While Elliot had invited the Chinese authorities to attend the trial, the Chinese smartly sidestepped the invitation as it would have amounted to a recognition of English jurisdiction in Chinese territories. Furthermore, Commissioner Lin viewed Elliot's court as an infringement of China's sovereignty and that the trial was a farce as the culprits were never handed over to the Chinese.
The reason this episode is so challenging is because the historical and legal facts of the Lady Hughes Incident has been hidden, cloaked by the deceitful propaganda of the British East India Company and the British Imperial Empire. This propaganda has been spread across the world through leading educational institutions and the cultural and social arms or instruments of the West. A simple example, Hollywood. They produce such movies as The Sand Pebbles, Peking in 55 Days, The Last Emperor, Year of the Dragon, Chinatown. Even right now, Netflix has a series called Warriors. It's actually quite interesting. And all these films project the Chinese as a corrupt, knife, sword wielding, savage, barbaric people without law, without order. Women get sold into indenturehood or brothels. So how did this happen? How did things get so twisted? Before the Lady Hughes Incident, the world respected, admired China, the Ming Dynasty, even the Qing Dynasty. They were admired. All this gets lost 2 to 3 decades after the Lady Hughes incidents. So, what was the Lady Hughes incident?
Anyway, I'm talking about the existence of Hong Kong. One country, 2 systems. This is rooted in the history of an Imperial British Empire, coercing the Qing Empire through a force of arms to relinquish territories that became the colony of Hong Kong. The reason was to open China Chinese markets to Great Britain. Now, the Chinese felt it needed nothing from the British. This was plainly stated in Emperor Qing Long's letter to King George III in 1793.
昨天你的大使请我的大臣就你对中国的贸易向我上书，但他的建议不符合我们王朝的惯例，不能接受。迄今为止，欧洲诸国，包括贵国的蛮商，都在广州与我天朝进行贸易，多年来一直如此。虽然我天帝国物产丰富，境内无物不发，因此没有必要进口外来野蛮人的制成品来换取我们自己的产品。但由于天朝生产的茶叶、丝绸和瓷器对欧洲各国和你们自己来说是绝对必需品，因此我们允许作为优惠的信号。
In consequence, the Chinese insisted on being paid in silver. The English solution to avoid payments in silver was to substitute this with opium, which was illegal in the Qing dynasty. And thus, the general perception as to why the Opium Wars were fought was to force China to accept opium as a legal trading commodity. However, opium is only an element of the story, and not the most important element. What propelled the cultural, legal, and military clashes between the Qing and the English into several full-blown wars is perhaps best illustrated by the Lady Hughes Incident in 1783. The Lady Hughes sailed into Whampoa, that's about 12 miles south of Canton, but that's where all the foreign ships came in. Now, the Portuguese are already well established by this time, of course, in Macau. The Spanish are in the Philippines, and the Dutch comes on a little later in 1600s and starts to take away a lot of Portuguese possessions, and they even take over Taiwan. The English are actually the last ones to get here. So this ship, the Lady Hughes, sails into Canton, and what happens is there's this tradition among the Westerners. As one ship leaves the harbor, another ship will fire a salute to it, although that is a felony under Qing law at that time. So what occurred was a Danish trading ship was leaving the harbor, and the Lady Hughes fired a cannon shot. The problem was this hit a little Chinese boat and killed someone, wounded two others, and the next day one of those gentlemen died. These were actually minor nobles of the Qing dynasty. So Governor Sun, S-U-N, of Guangzhou, asked for the English to turn over the gunner. The English came up with the story that he had absconded, which is a bit ridiculous. Obviously, if he gets off the boat and goes on land, he's not going to blend in with the Chinese population. If he got onto another ship, it would have to stop in Macau going out. And the Portuguese were very cooperative with the Qing and the Ming before them, the Ming dynasty, and they would have turned over the gunner to the Chinese authorities, as they did in the case of Francis Scott several years earlier. That was an Englishman. The English assertion that the gunner had fled was it's just kind of unbelievable. So the English stalled for about 3 days. And of course, the Qing governor got upset with this. And the emperor himself was looking at the case. And what happened was the Chinese eventually blockaded the western quarter in Canton, and with ships and soldiers, ships on the sea lanes, soldiers surrounding the factories, and cut off the food supply, cut off the water supply, took out all the Chinese personnel who were working there, were not allowed to go work there. What happened at first was the Danes, the Dutch, the French, the Americans all supported the English by saying the gunner supported the English position, the gunner had fled. And Governor Sun then met with representatives of each country except the English, and basically told them, you turn over the gunner and trade will get back to normal. So everyone broke ranks with the English, except the Americans. The Americans stood fast with the English on this. Now the owner, or the supercargo, that's the person in charge of the cargo of the Lady Hughes, was a man named George Smith. Now when the incident occurred, George Smith was in Canton, in one of the factories. Governor's son managed to trick him to leave the factory premises, and he was immediately surrounded by guards and taken into custody. Governor's son basically said he'll be released when you turn over the gunner. So this went on for approximately 5 days. And on the head of the East India Company, Pigou, that's his name, Pigou, he eventually sent a letter to the captain of the Lady Hughes. So what happened is a gentleman, about 35 years old, is turned over. He was like the oldest person on the ship at the time. So he is surrendered and George Smith is released. So at the time he surrendered, Governor's son assures the English representatives that he'll be returned unharmed. However, when the emperor heard about this, the English had also said, if you're going to try him, what we should do is have a mixed jury, which is a very strange request for a foreign country to come into China and basically demand to be part of the judiciary system. Especially in 1783, the Qing dynasty is at its apex. It's a very powerful country at this time, a powerful empire. The English also asked that the trial be held in the English factory, because previously a Frenchman had been hung a couple of years earlier, so they used that as an excuse why the gunner should be tried in the English factory. Of course, the Chinese did not accept that proposal. So what happened is once the gunner was turned over, blockade is lifted, Lady Hughes leaves. I believe this was all occurring in November 1783. So when January rolls around, 1784, the governor had recommended to the emperor to release the gunner into the custody of the English, and he would be brought back to England and be tried there. Because the governor was trying to keep the trade going and keep everything friendly with all the Western traders. The emperor didn't like this. He actually got quite angry. And he told the governor that if he didn't fix this properly, then the governor himself would be punished. So what happened was that the magistrate, who's handling the case, called the representatives of the Western nations into his court. And he basically admonished them and said that they're lucky because
the Chinese legal principle of a life for a life could be interpreted to mean the English should have surrendered 2 people to balance the loss of life suffered by 2 Chinese subjects. Yet, in this instant, the emperor would allow the strangulation of the gunner to suffice for the loss of 2 of his subjects.
The emperor ordered him to be strangled, a public execution of strangulation for killing 2 of his Chinese subjects. So he also ordered Governor's son to do it in front of the Western representatives, which the governor disregarded. So when the magistrate is talking to the representatives of the Western powers and admonishing them as to their bad behavior, because there are a lot of drunken brawls that go on at this time, sailors being sailors. As they're getting dressed down, at the exact same time, the gunner in another part of the city is being strangled in public. Obviously, the Westerners are quite angry when they find out about this, especially as Governor's son had assured them, they say, that the gunner would be returned unharmed. Not appreciating the emperor was going to step in and put his foot down on this. The English story is the gunner accidentally fires a cannon into a boat that killed 2 Chinese people. However, Sir Francis Davis, in his work in 1843, he later becomes governor of Hong Kong. He admits, he puts it in writing, that he's actually criticizing Chinese law. And the way he does it is that the gunner should not have been strangled because he was innocent. And the reason why the gunner was innocent was because the gunner was following the orders of the officer who told him to fire. So that's kind of a back-ass logic there. So if the gunner's innocent, then the officer is guilty for telling the gunner to fire. And the Western powers knew this at this time, okay? They knew what had happened. The Chinese might not have appreciated the officer gave the order to fire. And to make it even worse, the gunner had told the officer there was a Chinese boat in the line of fire, and the officer still told him to fire. That's murder, okay? That's murder. So the English basically went on to say that it was an accident, so it should be considered a manslaughter. So it is from this incident that the British East India Company and the British Empire, they'll take this incident and use it and to paint the Chinese judiciary as arbitrary, unjust, barbaric, and savage, strangling someone in public. Although in England at this time, people were being hung in public. I'm not sure what the difference is. So the British say, we're never going to turn over a guy again to the Chinese, and we need to have extraterritorial jurisdiction to handle these matters. So this is actually the root cause of the Opium Wars. It's not opium. In the Treaty of Nanking, opium is not even mentioned. So it's not opium. It's extraterritorial jurisdictions. And the Treaty of Nanking forces another 5 ports open. And the most important thing about the Treaty of Nanking,
Article 3, it being obviously necessary and desirable that British subjects should have some port whereat they may careen and refit their ships, when required, and keep stores for that purpose. His Majesty the Emperor of China cedes to Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain, etc., the island of Hong Kong, to be possessed in perpetuity by Her Britannic Majesty, her heirs and successors, and to be governed by such laws and regulations as Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain, etc., shall see fit to direct.
Before I continue, I have to give credit where credit is due. The revelations on the Lady Hughes incident isn't something I found. In fact, it actually was brought out in the public by Associate Professor Li Qian. For example, the English said that when the Chinese took George Smith as a hostage in order to force the release of the gunner, they took away his liberty. So that's an example of how barbaric the law is. But the Chinese view was we didn't take George Smith to punish George Smith. You left us no choice because you would not turn over the gunner for 3 or 4 days. So this was just simple leverage in order to get to the guilty party, and nothing was done to George Smith. He was treated very well. But the English would use this, basically an innocent person deprived of his liberty, which technically he was for about 3 days. I'll give you an example. The West basically said there was no presumption of innocence in the Qing legal system. And this is a joke because in 1783, the English operated under the presumption of guilt.
As expressed by Sir Matthew Hale in the 17th century, when one voluntarily kills another without any provocation, it is murder, for the law presumes it to be malicious. As expounded upon in the 3rd edition of Justice Sir Michael Foster's Treatise on Crown Law, published in 1806, in every charge of murder, the fact of killing being first proved, all the circumstances of accident, necessity, or infirmity are to be satisfactorily proved by the prisoner, unless they arise out of the evidence produced against him, for the law presumeth the fact to have been founded in malice, until the contrary appeareth.
And they had their own torture methods, such as putting bricks on a person until they confessed. If you were silent, you were guilty. If you were a defendant, you had to prove your innocence in 1783 in England.
From the mid-16th century, English law stipulated that those who were accused of homicide but did not answer directly according to laws or stood willfully mute would be convicted of murder and sentenced to capital punishment without the benefit of clergy. Thus, the British suspect's refusal to appear in a court would result in his murder conviction under English law. Moreover, until 1935, English law presumed all homicide suspects to be guilty of murder unless the accused proved otherwise. In contrast, Chinese law on homicide was not operating on the basis of such statutory conviction or presumption of guilt. Chinese judges were required to apprehend and examine all the suspects and witnesses to decide the nature of the crime, all within 6 months.
But the biggest misconception is the British had a presumption of innocence.
The first instance whereby English statute specifically stated the presumption of innocence could be used as a shield was the Prison Act of 1877. It was only set in stone throughout the Commonwealth in the 1935 case of Wilmington v. Director of Public Prosecution.
So, the Lady Hughes Incident, as a whole, altered history, heavily influenced Sino-Western relations for at least 2 centuries, still has impacts today because the Treaty of Nanking and subsequent treaties forced a treaty system onto China. Before that, it was the tributary system. So the British forced the treaty system onto the Qing. And that's also a very complicated story, but the bottom line is establishes extraterritorial jurisdiction for the English and other Western powers that would follow. And that's what the Opium War was really about. So what is underneath that? What is underneath that is trade, making money. The English needed Chinese tea. They were addicted to it.
The murder of 𝑪𝘰𝘮𝘮𝘦 is what started the First Opium War, and the primary reason was extraterritorial jurisdiction. Opium had nothing to do with this incident. Yet, it should clear that all sovereign nations will insist on having the ultimate jurisdiction in their own countries, and thus, there is no confusion as to why the Qing dynasty went to war. The question then becomes, why did the English insist on the rights of extraterritorial jurisdiction in China? The answer is British mercantilism. We have been taught that China was a backward nation and did not understand the concepts of free trade, while its laws were barbaric. So, in order to bring China into the international system, the English were left with little choice but to attack China and were forced to bring modernity to China. However, this is untrue. British imperial mercantilism was not the practice of free trade.
So, opium plays a part, but that was not the major reason. As I said, Treaty of Nanking doesn't even address opium whatsoever. It does address extraterritorial jurisdiction for English subjects in China. So that's the real reason of the Opium War. This treaty system then results in China's Century of Shame, which is still talked about today. So, in the sense that it's never going to happen again and make China great again. A lot of that motivation comes from what the West did to China. Anyway, so let's get back to the incident itself. Let's take a look at the comparative laws of China and England in 1784. The legalities involving the Lady Hughes are actually surprisingly far-reaching. It ranges from criminal laws and codes relating to manslaughter, or as the East India Company would say, homicide by misadventure, which is criminal negligence.
Under English law, homicide by misadventure is also known as excusable homicide, such as when one is executing a lawful act that result in the death of another. Or, if a person was working with an axe, the head of the axe breaks off and kills a passerby.
Felony homicide, obstructing the course of justice, accessories after the fact, aiding and abetting, to administrative law of procedures, the presumption of innocence, the sentencing guidelines, a jury trial in England versus a trial by a single judge in the Qing, and international law involving extraterritorial jurisdiction on one hand and purported human rights and liberties on the other hand. So this one incident has elements of all of that. Even according to the English law, Sir William Blackstone, very prominent specialist in English law, I think a lot of. All right, so he held that a homicide was excusable, meaning there's no criminal punishment, if and only if the suspect, by causing the demise of another person via an accident, was performing a legal action, and the suspect did not have any intention to cause harm. So, in his own words, I quote, he stated, "A fourth deficiency of will is where a man commits an unlawful act by misfortune or chance, and not by design. Here, the will observes a total neutrality and does not cooperate with the deed, which therefore wants one main ingredient of a crime. Of this, when it affects the life of another, we shall find more occasion to speak hereafter. At present, only observing that if an accidental mischief happens to follow from the performance of a lawful act, the party is excused from all guilt." To hammer the point home, if you look at
A Treatise of the Pleas of the Crown. Section 12. Neither shall he be adjudged guilty of a less crime who kills another in doing such a wilful act as slews him to be as dangerous as a wild beast, and an enemy to mankind in general, as by going deliberately with a horse used to strike, discharging a gun among a multitude of people, or throwing a great stone or piece of timber from a house into a street, through which he knows that many are passing, and it is no excuse that he intended no harm to any one in particular, or that he meant to do it only for sport, or to frighten the people.
So in the previous section, section 10, Hawkins defines murder. So Hawkins is speaking about murder in section 12. So when he says neither shall be adjudged guilty of a less crime, what Hawkins is saying, if you do those things, throwing a stone or timber off a ceiling into the street, riding your horse through a crowd, shooting your gun into a crowd, that is murder. Even if you had no intention of hurting someone, or you thought you were doing it as a joke or something. So when you apply that to the Lady Hughes case, the gunner discharged a cannon shot into a crowded area where he and his commanding officer knew many were passing, and that there's no justification whether the gunner and officer was showing off, being arrogant, having sport, trying to impress the Chinese or the Danish ship that was leaving. So you cannot argue simple negligence. Negligence is the failure to use care which a reasonably prudent man would use under the same or similar circumstances. So what reasonably prudent person would fire a cannon shot into a harbor bustling with trading activity? So the crimes described by Hawkins reflects there is an element of willful wrongdoing. The crime involves a reckless and wanton disregard for human life. And this puts the crime under the English law beyond mere negligent manslaughter, as the act was done willfully. So the proper charge under the English law at the relevant time, at minimum, is murder. So the East India Company's assertion, homicide by misadventure, is disingenuous, to say the least. So, as to Chinese law, criminal negligence in Chinese law was on the statutes as early as the Han Dynasty. The Chinese law regarding criminal intent was highly refined. There were specific penalties for each level of possible criminality, whether it was premeditated murder, murder in the heat of the moment, or a simple accident. And accidents were dealt with under the Gao Shi statute. If a homicide is completely accidental, that's the statute that would handle that. And the Qing thought of everything, a horse running wild, someone throwing a stone off the building, same as the English. Each act had its own penalty. So criminal negligence was not a single category of offense under late Chinese law, imperial law. Chinese law addressed the concept of criminal negligence, but it did so by degrees. For the Chinese, what had to be determined, what the magistrate would have to be determined, whether this was accidental or whether it was on purpose, was there's three rules. The first one was the meaning of which the ears and eyes do not reach. And this is a person did not see individuals coming, or he did not hear people coming around the corner. So you're ignorant that someone is coming, or you didn't see. Then the more important one is that which contemplation does not attain. And this means that if an incident happened in an isolated area, a space where no one was supposed to be, then it's reasonable that there was that this could be an accident. However, if your common sense tells you people are there, and you throw a grenade or fire a cannon, then reasonably you would know you're going to hurt somebody. So now, if it was by accident, under Chinese law, if it was an accident, it didn't matter if you killed somebody by fire, water, metal, stone, a cannonball, even a human limb. If it was, this was irrelevant. The weapon, the means of death was irrelevant if it was an accident. However, if they determined that it wasn't an accident, then the means of death was relevant. Normally, the way the Qing would deal with this, if it was an accident, there would be a payment of a sum of money to compensate the family of the victim. So this is why we can see why the English were arguing this was an accidental homicide. Because under English law, under Chinese law, that means a payment would be made. So one thing in common, Chinese and English law, was that if it was unforeseeable result of a lawful act, you're not guilty. So they both had that in common. So now in the gunner's case, even the conditions of the eyes did not see, as the gunner testified he did not see, and his ears did not hear, even if those conditions were met, the condition of contemplation does not attain was impossible to be met. So, because the harbor is full of ships of all sizes, there's huge trading going on. So it's impossible to argue unattainable contemplation. This just can't be reached in this case. This would not be covered under the 𝑳𝘪𝘬𝘦 statutes, and this moves it higher into Qing code, which is very complicated and specific. Under English law, discharging a cannon into an area of commerce that results in people being killed or injured for any normal person is considered foreseeable. So this would eliminate the gunner's crime from accidental homicide, even under English law. And also, during the trial, the English admitted that the Chinese boat was alongside the English ship. And so the English claim, and this is actually what they claimed, was that the Chinese sailors regrettably got in front of the cannon during the salute. So that's pretty ridiculous. It'd be comical if except people died, so it's not funny. So anyway, both English and Chinese law holds that an illegal act that kills someone would mean the suspect be held accountable for murder. In the English court, traditional English law did not give murder suspects the benefit of the assumption of innocence, which I had already mentioned before, presumption of guilt. An English jury would have needed to conclude the gunner intended to commit an act that was intrinsically linked to likely killing someone, even if he had no intention of hurting anyone. So the act is firing the cannon into a full harbor. So it's not a stretch that an English jury would have found the gunner guilty under English law. But the bottom line, what has happened is this Lady Hughes incident was hijacked by English propaganda in order to promote and paint the picture that the Chinese were a savage, backward race with an arbitrary legal system, and it would be unconscionable for England to allow this legal system to try any other English person. It was a big lie, and we believed that lie. Anyway, I think I'll wrap it up today. Yeah, so a lot of credit go to Associate Professor Li Chen, who has brought this out into the public eye. Although it's still not widely known. As far as the world is concerned, the Opium War was because of opium. That's not the case. All right, well, okay. So if you learned something new today, hit the like, share, subscribe this channel. Cheers.